Hey everyone, the deck I've made for this video is using Vaevictis Asmadi the Dyer for the commander, but he isn't required to make the deck work and acts more as a value piece. What this deck revolves around is using jank cards like Sylvan Basilisk and Nemesis Mask together to make your other creatures unblockable while also wiping an opponent's board of all its untapped creatures. We'll start off with the cards that want to be blocked by a bunch of creatures. There's 11 of these cards total. Going from lowest to highest CMC, first up in this section is Deadeye and Sledge. You can equip it to destroy all creatures blocked by the equipped creature, but the equipped creature will be destroyed too, so you won't want to equip it to something too valuable in your board. For 2 CMC I have Plague White and Tangle Asp. The white will clear all the 1 toughness creatures being blocked by it before the combat damage step, and Tangle Asp will destroy any creature blocked by it at the end of combat, which is really powerful for its low cost. There's also Venom, which is an aura enchantment with the same effect as Tangle Asp, except it won't work on wolves, not that that's much of a restriction. For 4 CMC we have 1 green and 1 black creature. Elven Warhounds will put any creature blocked by it on top of its owner's library, which is better than destroying the creature in probably most situations. And Dread Spectre will destroy all non-black creatures blocked by it at the end of combat. Up next is a few creatures for 5 mana with identical power and toughness, but each one is a bit different. Gorgon Recluse works the same as the previous creature mentioned, except it has Madness for 2 black. Then there's Thicket Basilisk, who works the same as the Venom enchantment, destroying all non-walls at the end of combat. But the best one out of these 3 is Sylvan Basilisk, since it will destroy any creature when it becomes blocked before the combat damage step, which makes him easily reusable. Second to last in this section is your playgroup. This card might not kill the biggest creatures on the board, but if an opponent is running a token strategy and you force blocks, then it can easily do huge direct damage to them. And finally for 7 mana is a big 7/7 worm that destroys all creatures blocking it before combat damage. Plus you gain life equal to the toughness of each creature destroyed. So we have all these creatures that want to be blocked, but how do you force your opponents to block with all of their creatures? Well, this next section has 11 cards that we can use to give the previously mentioned creatures that ability. There's a couple of sorceries for 3 mana. Alluring Scent just gives the regular effect, making all creatures able to block a target creature do so this turn. And Roar of Challenge does the same thing, except it will also make the creature indestructible if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, which you often will in this deck. There's also Lure, which is an aura that just has the regular effect that we want. And Tempting Lizard, which is a creature with a tap ability for 1 green mana that will essentially turn it into a lure, except you can pay 1 green mana at any time to end the effect and turn it back into a creature. This is probably the best card in this section. You can wait until the blockers are declared and then turn it back into a creature before the combat damage step to easily reuse it the next turn. Another really good reusable one is the Nemesis Mask equipment, which costs 3 mana to cast and 3 to equip. Now, starting our 4 CMC options is a card that will give the creature the effect at instant speed, but with no extra effects. Then there's Shannon of Life's Roar, which is a creature for 2 mana that has an effect forcing all creatures to block it that are able. You could play it as a creature if you have Deadeye and Sledge or Venom in hand, but I think most of the time you'd use the Channel ability for 4 mana to give another creature the effect at instant speed. There's a couple of split cards that have a 4-cost sorcery on one side with the effect we want. The first one has Fuse, so you can cast one or both halves of the card. The other half of that card is very usable for some of the creatures that trigger off combat damage that I'll go over in the next section. The Destined effect on the other card is also very usable as protection against destroy effects for an important piece, or it can be used just to make sure your creature that's forcing blocks doesn't get destroyed with everything else. Since the effect you want can only be cast from a graveyard, you'll probably usually do the latter option. Declare Dominance is another card with the effect, but for 5 mana, and it also gives the targeted creature +3/+3, not that that will be a factor very often. And lastly in this section is Noble Quarry, which has Bestow for 6 mana. When you cast the spell for its bestow cost, it's an aura enchantment with the effect we want, plus it'll give the enchanted creature +1/+1, and when the enchanted creature dies, the aura turns back into a creature, which is very usable even if we don't have a way to make it lethal to the blockers. Next, I'll go over several cards that will help make the deck work, or provide some benefit from your opponent's creatures dying. First is In Search of Greatness. It's an enchantment that lets you play a permanent card on your upkeep with CMC 1 higher than a permanent you control without paying its cost. If we have a quick look at the mana curve for the deck, you can see that it's got a lot of high cost cards and no significant dips until the 7 cost cards, so this card is a great fit in the deck. There's also Mirror Shield in the deck for protection on a valuable creature, and it has an additional effect of destroying all creatures with Death Touch who block the equipped creature, which could come into effect if someone in your playgroup has a Death Touch themed deck. Once your opponents know your strategy, they might swing with and tap their creatures to prevent them from being destroyed, but there's a couple of cards that can get around that. Benefactor's Drought will untap every creature on the board, essentially giving your creatures vigilance for a turn while also being a big draw spell for just 2 mana. It is a bit pricey, but definitely worth it. The other card to force untaps is Jangling Automaton, which is also really valuable for the deck, since you'll be able to use it every turn. The last 2 cards in this category are ones that'll steal your opponent's creatures after they've been destroyed. Geyser will exile those creatures until your upkeep, when they'll all be put onto the battlefield under your control but with Decayed. Grave Betrayal is a lot more mana, but you get the creatures put under your control on each player's end step, and it doesn't come with any restrictions. You actually get a buff on those creatures. There's also a few cards in the deck for removal. Obviously the deck is kind of themed on creature removal, so we don't need any extra of that. But what there is Sunder Shaman, which will destroy an artifact or enchantment the player controls that it deals damage to. There's also Blade Griff Prototype. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player gets to choose and destroy a non-land permanent one of your other opponents control. I really like this card because a lot of the time an opponent will just choose to take the damage trade-off to be able to remove something problematic. And the commander is actually the last piece of extra removal for the deck. He triggers off attack and you get to destroy a permanent for each player, then everyone plays the top card of their library for free if it's a permanent card. So you can sacrifice a token or something else that's not very valuable on your board to probably get something better off the top of your library, and remove your opponent's best permanents at the same time. So, I've gone over the cards that are used to lure your opponent's creatures to their death, but what about the creatures you want to deal damage on your opponents? The first one for just 2 mana is Hepatra, who will let you put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, and then you create a 1/1 snake creature with Death Touch. For 3 mana there's Virtus the Veiled, which will make the player it hits lose half of their life, which is especially good when playing against life gain themed decks. And Spawnwraith will create a copy of itself, which can create a big token army pretty quickly if you slot in some cards that give extra combat phases. Then there's Havengul Vampire, which is only a 2/2 when you play it, but it'll get big very quickly, especially if an opponent is playing an aristocrat theme. For 5 CMC is Froghemoth, which I really like for graveyard hate, especially against mill or self mill decks, since it'll be able to exile more cards each turn if it's getting the 1/1 counters. Up next is Necropolis Regent, who doesn't actually need to attack, but will essentially make your creatures twice as big once they fully connect on an opponent. Her ability can get out of hand very quickly, making a 5/5 creature with double strike a 20/20 after dealing damage on an opponent. Another creature that can get out of hand quickly is Giant Adderphage. Just like Spawnwraith, it'll make a copy of itself on dealing combat damage, except it's a 7/7, so a much bigger threat than the Spawnwraith. And finally in this category is 2 very high CMC creatures. Living Hive will create a number of 1/1 insect tokens based off the amount of damage it does to an opponent, which can be great to use as blockers or as your luring creature with the right setup. Scion of Darkness is also a 6/6 with trample, but with him you get to put an opponent's creature from their graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. With this deck being focused around creature removal, there's bound to be a bunch of good options for his ability, and if there isn't, or you pull him too early in the game, then you can just cycle him to maybe recur him later. Speaking of recursion, you're going to want several ways to get your creatures back, since the ones dedicated for luring will die pretty often, so there's 6 cards in the deck for just that purpose. Reusable creature recursion is really valuable for the deck, and for just 1 black mana there's 2 options. With Phyrexian Reclamation, you can pay 2 life plus 1 into black mana to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. And Tortured Existence lets you pay a black mana to swap a creature in your hand with one in your graveyard. Victimize is also in the deck. It can get crazy value if you have 2 big CMC creatures in your graveyard and a token or some other non-essential creature to sacrifice. There's also Eternal Witness, which can bring any card back, and with reusable creature recursion it can get really good value. For that same reason, Timeless Witness is in the deck. It does cost 1 more mana to cast, but it's well worth it to have more than one option for non-creature recursion. Finally in the recursion category is Storev, who will return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand on dealing combat damage to an opponent, but it does unfortunately come with the restriction that the card can't have been put in your graveyard that turn. Next I'll go over the cards that help to keep your hand full of options. The first one to go over is actually the best draw card in the deck. It lets you choose to draw 2 cards for each creature blocking the equipped creature. For only 1 mana to cast and 1 to equip, this card could get ridiculous value when equipped on one of your luring creatures. Another equipment for draw is Mask of Memory, except this one should go on creatures you want to connect with opponents, and when it does you can draw 2 then discard a card. Up next is the 2 3 CMC draw spells. The first one is Garruk's Harbinger, who lets you draw a creature from the top of your library on dealing combat damage. Also, if it gets buffed up, then it's even more effective at finding a desired creature. The other 3 mana spell is Hunter's Insight, which draws based off a creature's combat damage. It is single use, but with all the high power creatures in this deck, it's worth a slot. For 2 more mana, Hunter's Prowess has the same effect but at sorcery speed, and it gives the targeted creature +3/+3 in trample. Then there's 3 big 6 CMC cards. The first is Harvester of Souls, which will let you draw a card whenever any other non-token creature dies. With all the creatures on opponents' boards that you'll be destroying, this card is well worth the mana cost. The next 2 cards aren't exactly draw spells, but they'll let you play some spells for free that weren't in your hand. Atali triggers off attack and lets you play up to 4 random spells for free, which is a lot of fun for casual commander games. And Sunbird's Invocation works really well at playing free cards in this deck specifically because of its relatively high mana curve. Because of that mana curve, the ramp for this deck is probably the most important category. Of course there's a Soul Ring in the deck. Not really any explanation needed on that one, it's in more than 80% of all decks tracked by EDH Rec. There's also an Aura enchantment that lets you search for a basic land card and put it into play tapped when the enchanted creature deals combat damage. Even if you get only 1 use out of this card, it's still a rampant growth for 1 less mana. Speaking of rampant growth, it's reliable and a pretty good card, so it's worth a slot in the deck. Sakata Tribouter can be really good in this deck as well if you pull one of those reusable recursion cards. Then there's Goblin Anacomancer and Thunderscape Familiar. The Goblin will reduce the cost of your red and green spells, and the Familiar does the same but with black and green. I really like both of these creatures, especially the Familiar since the deck is predominantly black and green cards. For 3 mana is a couple more classic ramp cards in the way of Cultivate and Harrow, but there's also Gadrak, which will make a treasure for each non-token creature that died on your turn. Obviously, like a lot of the other cards in the 99, it's a great fit because of the creature removal theme in the deck. Another ramp card that fits the theme is Black Market. It's less restrictive than Gadrak and can produce a huge amount of black mana on your main phase. Finally in the ramp section is Sakiko. It does cost 6 mana to play, but it easily replaces the mana you spent if you have just 1 big creature that's able to connect on an opponent. The main downside is that it only produces green mana, but it's still well worth the mana cost in this deck. And the final category is of course the land base. There is a decent amount of non-basics. First off is the red and green hideaway lands. Both of the conditions on these cards are pretty easy to meet in the deck, and are really worth coming in tapped if you get to exile a big CMC creature under the lands. I've also put all 3 of the Scry lands available in Jund colours for the deck because card selection in this deck is pretty important. You don't usually want to draw a large CMC card at the start of the game or vice versa. There's also the Jund Tri-land and Command Tower, which can both tap for any of the colours you need. And Exotic Orchard will usually be able to tap for the colours you need, depending on the decks you play against. There's also 3 lands that will fetch you a basic land. Of course Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, but also Jund Panorama, which can tap for 1 colourless mana, or you can pay 1 mana to tap and sacrifice it and search for a swamp, mountain or forest and put it into play tapped. Speaking of which, for the basics there's 8 swamps, 3 mountains and 13 forests, which make up the rest of the lands. So that's all of the 100 cards gone over, but I've deliberately made the deck try to be able to interact with a lot of different types of decks and to have many different options to take. The downside of that though is that it might not be focused enough, therefore if you do consider making or buying this deck, there's some cards you could slot in to help with that. I've taken most of these cards out of the deck because they were too specific on what they did or cost too much mana to play. Some of them do have pretty interesting effects though, and they're worth taking another look at. Finally, I'll go over 10 upgrades that I think would be really good fits for the deck but cost too much for me to stay under a $75 budget. First off, I'd swap Rampant Growth out for Sword of the Animist and Harrow for Goreclaw. Revel Riches can provide all colours of mana and a win con, so Black Market could be taken out for that, and Old Gnawbone is essentially a better version of Sakiko. I would remove Froghemoth in favour of Port Razor, and Sunder Shaman could go to fit in Morag. The extra combat phases that these creatures provide are really great in this deck. Inkars is pretty much a better version of Scion of Darkness, so that's an easy swap. And Sword of Light and Shadow works very similar to Stariev but comes with no restrictions and a lot more benefits. Rhythm of the Wild could take Mirror Shield slot for haste on your creatures and protection against counterspells. And finally I'd take out Atali Primal Storm to put in Hellkite Tyrant. But that's everything I wanted to go over. If you made it this far into the video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Thank you all for watching.